I am Mike D, and this is the history of money, banking, and trade. Here's what I want you to think about. Every financial system you interact with today, every bank, every currency, every credit arrangement is the product of 1,000 years of human ingenuity, necessity, and occasionally spectacular failure. This podcast is the story of how it all began, evolved, and became the world we live in. We're starting in the ancient world, and we're not stopping until we reach the present. Welcome aboard. Last time, we talked about Rome's first credit crisis under Tiberius and the catastrophe at Mount Vesuvius. Today, we are rewinding the clock slightly and widening the lens to look at the men who actually built and ran Rome's financial machine in the first place. And at that moment, decades later, when that machine started quietly breaking down. This is the story of four emperors: Augustus, the architect; Tiberius, the steward; Caligula, the spendthrift; and Nero, the man who discovered that you don't need to rob anyone to steal their money. You just need to control the mint. After roughly 2 centuries of near constant internal conflict, the long, grinding collapse of the Roman Republic, Octavian's victory over Mark Antony, and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE brought that era to a close. The civil wars were over. The Republic, in any meaningful sense, was finished, even if no one dared to say it out loud. And that's the key thing to understand about Octavian, who would later be known as Augustus. He was never an emperor in the way we think of the term today. Romans despised the idea of a monarchy. It was practically a dirty word, a betrayal of everything the Republic claimed to stand for. So Augustus didn't seize a crown. He performed a return to normalcy. In 27 BCE, in a piece of political theater historians call the First Settlement, he formally handed control of the provinces and allegiance back to the Senate. The Senate, in turn, asked, quote-unquote, asked him to retain control of the most unstable provinces, which conveniently happened to be the ones containing the bulk of Rome's military. The Senate then granted him the title of Augustus, meaning the illustrious one. He governed with near total power, while maintaining every outward appearance of republican humility. A few years later, following a serious illness in 23 BCE, he adjusted the arrangement again in the Second Settlement, resigning the consulship but acquiring something called imperium maius, supreme authority that outranked every other magistrate in every province, along with the power to veto Senate legislation. He had built himself an emperor's power inside a Republican-shaped box. But the story I really want to tell you is one almost no one else tells. Augustus, the accountant. Augustus, the financial engineer. When Augustus took control, the Roman fiscal system was, frankly, disaster. There was no coherent empire-wide tax structure, no reliable census of where revenue should come from, and a military that had ballooned to roughly 60 legions during the Civil War years, an enormous, unsustainable drain on resources. Augustus did something almost nobody in his position chose to do. He scaled back. He reduced the permanent military to approximately 28 legions. He paired this with new, more systemic tax revenue, a more disciplined approach to provincial taxation and custom duties. Combined, these reforms put imperial finances on a sustainable footing for the first time in generations. Ancient sources tell us he left the treasury in healthy surplus when he died in 14 CE. He took this seriously enough that he kept his own account books, a personal ledger he used both to plan state projects and, frankly, as propaganda. There's a wonderful, almost absurd detail from the period. Augustus boasted that he personally paid victorious soldiers 170 million sesterces out of his own funds. whether that money was his own in any meaningful sense, separate from the state's coffers, is a very modern-sounding question, and exactly the kind of blurred public-private boundary that shows up again and again throughout financial history. Now, it's worth pausing for a moment on how unusual this was. Max Weber, the great sociologist of the early 20th century, argued that ancient finance was generally limited to what he called stores accounting, the kind of bookkeeping you'd use to track how many amphorae of wine or sacks of grain you had on hand. Weber believed the ancient world lacked a true concept of profit in the modern sense, and lacked any method of valuing the total assets of the enterprise over a defined period, like a fiscal year. That kind of double entry period-based accounting wouldn't fully take hold until more than 1,000 years later in Renaissance Italy. Augustus's instinct to track and plan using his own ledgers was, in that light, generally ahead of his time, even if it fell short of modern accounting standards. Military pay and bonuses, the money required to keep the legions loyal, consumed somewhere between 50 and 70% of total imperial revenue. Infrastructure, the grain supply that fed the city of Rome's enormous urban population, and basic administration ate up most of what remained. In normal times, this system worked fine, but Rome had no elastic revenue mechanism for emergencies. Think about the tools a modern state has when it faces a fiscal crunch. It can raise taxes through established legislative channels. It can issue sovereign debt and sell its bonds in markets. Its central bank can deploy monetary tools like quantitative easing to inject liquidity into the system. Rome had none of these in any developed form. It could raise taxes, but that was politically explosive and, more importantly, limited by what an agrarian economy could actually bear. It could debase its coinage, which is reduce the precious metal content to stretch the money supply further. But that risked inflation and eroded the public's trust in money itself. Or the third option, it could just conquer new territory, extracting plunder, slaves, and freshly taxable land. The third option, which was expansion, was Rome's fiscal release valve. For a very long time, it worked brilliantly, but it depended entirely on there being new territory worth conquering and the military strength to take it. Eventually, that well would run dry. And when it did, the fragility Augustus had so carefully papered over would become impossible to ignore. There's a charming detail buried in the ancient sources. Augustus was, by all accounts, a genuine coin collector. He gathered coins of all types, foreign currencies, the mintages of long-dead ancient kings, possibly inheriting the habit, and some of the actual coins from his father and grandfather. Interestingly, those relatives had been mocked by Augustus's political rivals as mere bankers and money changers. A reminder that even in Rome, there's a certain old money snobbery directed at people who work too closely with money itself. That personal fascination may have informed what came next. Augustus undertook a comprehensive overhaul of the Roman monetary system that would define imperial coinage for the next 300 years. Bronze and copper coinage has circulated in Italy for at least 400 years before Augustus. These coins would have handled the small daily transactions that gold and silver were too valuable to practically serve. Augustus reintroduced standardized copper alloy coins on a true imperial scale. These coins were worth far less than their face value in actual metal, but that was precisely the point. Nobody hoarded a low-value token coin. People spent it as fast as they can get it. Archaeologists find these coins scattered individually across Roman sites rather than in buried hoards, which was physical evidence 2,000 years later of just how freely they circulated. What gave people confidence in token coinage worth more than its metal content? Partially the sheer strength and stability of the imperial government itself, partially through expectation, though the precise legal mechanics remain somewhat uncertain to modern historians, that these tokens could be exchanged for silver or gold at imperial mints if needed. This is fiat-adjacent thinking, emerging organically more than 1,000 years before anyone wrote it down as a theory. Meanwhile, the silver denarius remained the real workhorse of the Roman commerce and military pay. At its original minting under the Republic, it weighed approximately 4.5 grams of near pure silver. Under Augustus, this weight settled to around 3.9 grams with a purity of about 98%, which was still an extraordinarily high-quality trusted coin. Gold aurei, which Julius Caesar had introduced into regular circulation, were reserved for elite transactions, large payments, and treasury operations rather than everyday market business. Augustus centralized mint operations and standardized weights of purity across the entire system, building on reforms Caesar had begun. The result was coinage of remarkable consistency, the foundation of monetary confidence that would hold together a geographically vast, culturally diverse empire for generations. It's also worth understanding the plumbing of where Romans actually kept their money, because Rome never developed anything like a unified banking system in any modern sense, and the absence shaped everything else. Because the emperors personally controlled the mints, there was limited structural incentive to build out independent banking institutions the way later medieval and early modern states would. Rome bankers, known as argentarii, or money changers, operated instead from a row of storefronts along the north side of the Roman Forum, what was effectively called Janus Street, the Wall Street of the ancient world. Janus, fittingly, was the god credited with inventing money in Roman mythology, and also served as a defender god of Rome's institutions and laws. His temple had a unique civic ritual attached to it. The doors stayed open during the times of war and were ceremonially closed during peace. Nearby, the Temple of Saturn held the actual state treasury, the literal vault of Rome. Romans with money to set aside or grow had essentially three options. They could entrust it to a private banker who, if the deposit was a simple checking style balance, paid no interest but would honor withdrawals as long as the funds remained. If instead the money was deposited as a fixed-term interest-bearing credit, the banker was permitted to use and invest those funds for his own benefit, not unlike a modern certificate of deposit, except the depositor's protections were far thinner. Second, money could be entrusted to the priests at the temple for safekeeping. Third, the state itself maintained guarded public vaults where wealthy citizens could store valuables directly. These parallel financial systems, private banking, religious institutions, and state custody operating side by side, each serving a slightly different need for security and trust. Augustus was the architect. His successor, Tiberius, who ruled from 14 to 37 CE, was something else entirely, the steward. If Augustus designed the company, Tiberius was the conservative, unglamorous chief financial officer who ran it with relentless discipline. Tiberius pursued no major territorial expansion. Instead, he consolidated and strengthened Rome's existing frontiers, particularly along the Rhine and the Danube, rather than pushing further outward. He avoided expensive military adventures. He cut spending on public games and spectacles, scaled back lavish imperial gifts, and by the standards of Roman emperors, lived modestly. He skipped the grand building programs that consumed resources under other rulers. The financial results were striking. Tacitus, our most careful ancient source, reports that Tiberius left approximately 2.7 billion sesterces in the imperial treasury at his death in 37 CE. For a sense of the scale, one sesterce represented roughly a day's wage for an unskilled laborer, which means we're talking about a reserve equivalent to billions of days of unskilled labor. I'll flag the obvious caveat here. Converting ancient monetary figures into modern dollar equivalents is a notoriously imprecise exercise, and any specific modern dollar conversion should be treated as rough illustration rather than a precise calculation. But by any measure, it was an enormous accumulated surplus. We covered the financial crisis of 33 CE in detail in our last episode. That was the credit crunch triggered when decades-old lending laws from Julius Caesar's era were suddenly aggressively enforced. But there's another important piece of monetary history from Tiberius's reign worth highlighting here, because it's arguably the more important precedent for the rest of this episode. Earlier, under Augustus, the treasure of the conquered kingdom of Egypt had been brought back to Rome in enormous quantities. Money became plentiful. Interest rates fell from about 6% to roughly 4%. But after Augustus' death, Tiberius, ever the cautious steward, began hoarding money rather than circulating it, and interest rates climbed back above the legal ceiling. This hoarding behavior was one of the contributing pressures behind the credit crisis of 33 CE that we explored last time. Tiberius' eventual response, lending out a substantial portion of the imperial treasury interest-free directly to patrician families, brought an immediate decline in interest rates and helped end the crisis. Some financial historians have described this as the world's first documented experiment in something resembling quantitative easing, which is a central authority injecting liquidity directly into the credit system during a crunch, which was 2,000 years before the term even existed. There is a strange footnote from Tiberius' reign just to illustrate how thoroughly money was woven into every corner of Roman life. He reportedly issued an edict that no coin bearing the image of his predecessor, Augustus, could be carried into a Roman brothel or bathroom on penalty of death. Some historians believe sexually explicit coins, which is not unlike modern brothel tokens, may have circulated in place of regular coins for these specific transactions, which was precisely to avoid this kind of sacrilege. Money, even then, found a way around inconvenient rules. Tiberius' methods were not uniformly admirable. Wealthy senators were sometimes accused of treason on flimsy grounds, with their estates confiscated into the treasury, a pattern that blurred the lines between legitimate judicial process and outright state seizure of private wealth. Political purges generated very real asset transfers into the imperial coffers through the mechanisms that any era would recognize as the use of state power for financial extraction. But taken as a whole, Tiberius' fiscal record was one of disciplined accumulation. At a moment when the imperial system was still finding its footing and the memory of late Republican financial chaos remained fresh, his conservative management provided real institutional stability. He preserved and reinforced what Augustus had built, without the dramatic innovation or the dramatic risk that bolder rulers might have introduced. Between the two of them, Augustus and Tiberius gave the Roman Empire the fiscal foundations that would sustain itself for generations. The stresses that would eventually crack the foundation, the military overextension, currency debasement, plague, and the hard structural limits of an economy that needed conquest to fund itself, were still in the future. But the future, as it always does, was coming fast. Before we get into Caligula and Nero, I want to pause on a question that the Roman monetary system forces us to confront directly, because it'll make everything that follows land harder. There is a long-running debate in modern theory between two camps: those who see money as a commodity, a thing with inherent value like a chunk of silver, and those who see money as essentially an IOU, a social and political relationship backed by trust. The honest answer is, as so often the case, it's a bit of both. Look at a coin from your own pocket. One side, heads, carries a symbol of the political authority that minted it. That's the social, relational side of money. A reminder that the state underwrites the currency, and that money is fundamentally a relationship between the people in a society. The other side, the tail side, specifies the precise value the coin represents in exchange. That's the commodity side, the coin as a thing, capable of entering into definitive relationships with other things, regardless of who's involved. A purely commodity-based system has obvious problems. It ties your entire money supply to however much gold or silver you happen to be able to dig up or conquer. But a system of pure credit money has serious problems too. Credit money runs entirely on trust, and in competitive markets, especially between strangers who've never met and have no ongoing relationship, the trust itself becomes a genuine scarce resource. Within the Roman Empire, a silver coin stamped with the image of Tiberius might circulate at a value noticeably higher than the actual silver it contained. This was a consistent pattern. Ancient coins almost always circulated above their raw metal value, largely because the issuing government was willing to accept them at full face value for taxes and obligations. But step outside that government's authority and the equation changes. The Persian government probably wouldn't honor a Roman coin at face value. The Mauryan and Chinese governments almost certainly would not. And yet, enormous quantities of Roman gold and silver coins did end up in India and even in China. The coins would have flowed east along trade routes in exchange for silk, spices, and luxury goods. This is almost certainly the real reason these coins were minted in gold and silver in the first place, rather than purely as a token currency. Outside Rome's borders, only the actual metal content carried guaranteed value. Within a smaller community, a single town, a guild, a religious society, pretty much anything could function as money as long as everyone involved trusted that someone else would accept it later to settle a debt. Trust shrinks the geography over which the currency can confidently operate. That's a principle that holds true for the US dollar today, as it did for the Roman denarius 2,000 years ago. Keep that principle in mind. It's about to become very relevant. When Tiberius died in 37 CE, the throne passed to his grand-nephew, Gaius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, better known to history by his childhood nickname Caligula, meaning little boots, after the miniature soldier's uniform he wore as a boy, following his father around the military camps. Caligula is remembered as one of history's great examples of erratic, tyrannical rule, though it's worth flagging up front that some of that reputation may be exaggerated propaganda from political enemies who had every real reason to blacken his name after his death. Still, even accounting for bias, the broad outline is still damning. Unlike his predecessor, Caligula was not a disciplined administrator. He funded lavish games and gladiatorial spectacles. He handed out massive cash bonuses to ordinary citizens and the Praetorian Guard. He pursued extravagant building projects, including sprawling palace expansions. Well, at least it wasn't a ballroom, I guess. But either way, ancient sources claim he burned through a significant portion of the treasury surplus Tiberius had so carefully built, astonishingly quickly, within a few years. The stranger stories about Caligula are almost too colorful to be entirely fabricated, yet too strange to take entirely at face value. He reportedly wanted to be worshipped as a living god, dressed at various points as Jupiter, Apollo, and even Venus, and ordering statues of himself placed inside temples. One particularly inflammatory episode involved an attempt to install his own statue inside the temple in Jerusalem, an act that nearly provoked open revolt in Judea. He's said to have mocked and insulted senators openly, with little regard for the political consequences. The most famous Caligula legend, that he planned to appoint his horse as consul, is interpreted by most historians not as literal fact, but as either a piece of political satire mocking the Senate's relevance, or as a later exaggeration designed to cement his reputation as unhinged. He reportedly orders soldiers to gather seashells along the English Channel coast as spoils of Neptune, a moment historians still debate as either genuine instability, deliberate symbolism, or dark political theater aimed at his own troops. His reign ended the way so many destabilizing reigns do, violently. Members of his own Praetorian Guard assassinated him, along with his wife and daughter, in 41 CE. The Senate briefly, very briefly, debated restoring the old republic. Instead, the Guard elevated his uncle Claudius to the throne. Economically, Caligula's impact was real but not structurally transformative. His reign only lasted 4 years, which simply just wasn't enough time to permanently reshape Rome's monetary system the way a longer reign might have. But he absolutely disrupted fiscal stability. The treasury reserve was significantly reduced. Exactly how much is debated, given that our main source had political incentives to make him look as reckless as possible. His extravagant spending did provoke a kind of short-term economic stimulus, paid for entirely out of the fiscal cushion Tiberius had spent years of building. To close the resulting gap, Caligula reportedly targeted Rome's wealthy elite with aggressive new levies and forced contributions, a strategy that predictably encouraged exactly the kind of behavior you'd expect: capital flight, asset concealment, and hoarding among those who had the means to protect their wealth. Despite all this, the underlying Roman monetary system, the coinage itself, remained structurally intact. The damage was fiscal, not monetary. That distinction matters because it's about to disappear under his successor's successor. The story of how Claudius became emperor is one of the great accidents of Roman history. After Caligula's assassination, Claudius, by most accounts, a nervous, physically awkward man who had spent his life excluded from high office, and he reasonably assumed his entire family was about to be slaughtered along with the rest of the imperial household. His solution was to hide in the palace. The story, almost certainly embellished, but too good not to tell, holds that a member of the Praetorian Guard found him hiding behind a curtain because his feet were visible underneath. Claudius assumed he was about to be dragged off to his execution. Instead, he was handed a laurel wreath and proclaimed the new emperor of Rome. You talk about an amazing turn of events. To go from, I'm going to get murdered, to becoming the most powerful man in the world is quite astonishing, and it happened really quickly. But the question is, why Claudius? largely because the guard believed he'd be easy to control. According to ancient sources, he had a noticeable speech impediment, walked with a limp, and showed visible physical tremors. Outward signs that, fairly or not, marked him as weak in the eyes of Rome's political class. Modern scholarship suggests he may have had a neurological condition such as cerebral palsy or symptoms resembling Tourette syndrome, though his intellect was demonstrably sharp. He maintained genuine scholarly interest in history and law throughout his life. Many aristocrats had written him off as a socially awkward and politically irrelevant. Exactly the kind of figure the Praetorian Guard could install and then quietly run the empire through. He was, in effect, an insurance policy. The Guard had just assassinated an emperor and badly needed reassurance that they wouldn't face retaliation. A grateful, dependent new emperor, chosen and effectively installed by the Guard itself, solved that problem. Claudius rewarded them handsomely with a substantial cash bonus upon taking the throne, and because no retribution followed, an important and dangerous precedent was set. The Praetorian Guard now knew it could make emperors. They were the new kingmakers. The Guard, it turned out, had badly miscalculated, or maybe on the flip side, gotten remarkably lucky, depending on how you want to look at it. Once in power, Claudius proved to be a genuinely competent administrator, willing to execute senators who stepped out of line and far from anyone's puppet. He accomplished something even Julius Caesar himself had never managed, the conquest of Britain in 43 CE. The Romans founded the city of Londinium, the seed of modern London, somewhere between 47 and 50 CE, establishing it as a commercial port and a strategic road hub on the River Thames, from which it grew rapidly into the capital of Roman Britain. Economically, Claudius had a stabilizing and expansionary effect. Unlike Caligula, who had burned through reserves, Claudius paired infrastructure investment with administrative reform, all without destabilizing the currency. His annexation of Britain brought new tax revenue, access to valuable mineral resources, tin, lead, and silver, and expanded trade routes. Critically, he did not significantly debase the silver denarius. Gold and silver coinage remained stable throughout his reign. We even have evidence of Rome's reach by this point. Roman imperial coins had traveled as far as Sri Lanka, prompting an Asian diplomatic embassy to be sent to Claudius's court. Claudius died, almost certainly by poisoning, in the early hours of October 13, 54 CE. Tradition holds that the poison was delivered in mushrooms, a dish he was known to favor, possibly followed by a second dose administered on a feather under the pretense of inducing vomiting. Nearly every major ancient source places responsibility on his final wife, Agrippina the Younger. In the months before his death, the relationship had reportedly soured so badly that Claudius reportedly began speaking more openly about restoring prominence to his biological son, Britannicus, who was nearing adulthood, a shift that, if it had taken hold, would have directly threatened both Agrippina's position and the succession prospects of her own son. That son was named Nero. When Claudius died, Nero was just 17 years old. Britannicus was still a minor. Within a year, Britannicus too was dead, collapsing suddenly at a banquet under circumstances ancient sources overwhelmingly attribute to poisoning at Nero's direction. Since he was still just a teenager, early in his reign, real power rested largely with his mother Agrippina. Even so, early coinage even depicted mother and son facing one another, an unusually direct visual statement of shared authority. But Nero ended up chafing under her control. And by 59 CE, the relationship had deteriorated so badly that he ordered her assassination. After a failed, elaborate attempt to drown her in a collapsing boat, she was finally killed at her villa. With Agrippina gone, Nero ruled alone, and his personal life grew correspondingly darker. His first wife, Claudia Octavia, was divorced on dubious grounds and later executed after public sympathy for her began to stir unrest. His second wife, Poppaea Sabina, died in 65 CE. Ancient writers claim that Nero had killed her while she was pregnant. Whether the details are literal or exaggerated by hostile later historians, the story cemented his image as a violent and unstable person. But here's the more interesting and frankly underrated part of Nero's reign. While Rome's senatorial elite increasingly despised him, he cultivated something genuinely unusual for a Roman emperor: popular appeal. He reduced certain taxes. He staged lavish public games. He personally performed music and poetry before crowds, which the Senate found deeply disgraceful. Emperors were supposed to project Roman austerity and gravitas, not Greek theatrical flair. But ordinary citizens experienced Nero as accessible, entertaining, and generous in ways previous emperors hadn't bothered to be. Then, in July of 64 CE, came the event that would define his legacy forever: the Great Fire of Rome. It burned for 6 days and devastated huge sections of the city. Later historians like Cassius Dio blamed Nero outright for starting it. Tacitus, our more careful source, says he generally wasn't sure. The famous image of Nero fiddling while Rome burned is almost certainly a later invention. The violin wouldn't be invented for another 15 centuries, so obviously he wasn't fiddling when it burned. Nero, in fact, wasn't even in the city when the fire began, but suspicion stuck to him regardless, and in the fire's aftermath, he needed someone to blame. He found his scapegoat in a small, unpopular religious sect, the Christians. He accused them of arson and subjected many to brutal public executions. Some burned alive, and others were killed in stage spectacles. These persecutions weren't an empire-wide campaign, but they left a permanent scar on Christian memory. For centuries afterward, Nero would be remembered as the embodiment of evil. And some say early Christian writers identified him outright as the Antichrist. In the fire's wake, Nero rebuilt Rome and built something else alongside it: the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, a sprawling palace complex with artificial lakes, manicured gardens, and a colossal statue of himself. To his critics, this confirmed everything that they had already believed about him. Rome had burned, and Nero had built himself a palace on the ashes. With all that being said, here is where Nero earns his lasting place in monetary history. Not for the fire, not for the persecutions, for something far quieter and, in the long run, far more consequential. To fund his building projects and rising military costs, Nero didn't need to resort to mafia-style shakedowns of the business community. He had a much more elegant tool available: the mint. Around 64 to 65 CE, Nero reduced the silver content of the denarius. The exact figures are debated among historians and numismaticists. Older analysis put the new purity around 93.5%, while more recent, more rigorous metallurgic work by researchers Kevin Butcher and Matthew Ponting suggests the real figure may have dropped as low as 80%. The coin's weight shrank too, from roughly 3.9 grams down to somewhere between 3.4 and 3.8 grams, depending on which scholarly analysis you follow. Whatever the precise number, the direction and the intent are not in dispute. This was a formal, deliberate adjustment to the imperial mint standards, implemented openly through state-controlled mints, as part of a broader fiscal response to the cost of rebuilding after the fire and financing ongoing military campaigns, including in Armenia. In doing this, Nero institutionalized monetary debasement as a standing fiscal instrument, and he wasn't the last. Reductions in coin purity had happened occasionally before, in small temporary increments that were typically restored once the circumstances allowed. What Nero started was different, a large-scale, sustained debasement that would continue, emperor after emperor, for the next 2 centuries. By around 150 CE, Denarius' purity had fallen to roughly 83%. By 250 CE, it had collapsed to around 50%. The debasement that began as Nero's quiet fiscal patch eventually became one of the structural forces behind Rome's long economic decline. Here's the mechanism in plain terms. Debasement let the state extract more coins from the same fixed quantity of precious metal, mint more denarii, using less silver per coin, and then spend those coins at full face value, capturing the difference as implicit revenue. Economists call this seigniorage. It's essentially a hidden tax on everyone who holds and uses the currency, collected not through legislation, but through this simple physical composition of the coin itself. From a modern fiat currency perspective, this concept doesn't disappear. It just changes form. Modern dollars don't have a silver content to reduce. Instead, debasement today happens through the expansion of the money supply itself. Central banks and governments affect the modern equivalent of debasement through quantitative easing, sustained low interest rates, or simply financing deficits by issuing new currency. The mechanism is different, the result is functionally identical. More units of currency chasing the same quantity of goods and services, which erodes the purchasing power over time. Inflation is debasement without the metallurgy. In Rome, these slightly debased coins circulated alongside older, purer coins. And Roman coinage, remember, functioned on a fundamentally fiduciary basis, backed by state authority rather than the purity of the metal content. The new, lower silver coins were accepted at full face value. The reason was because the imperial stamp remained authoritative and trusted. Over time, the older, higher silver coins tended to disappear from circulation. They were hoarded or melted down by people who had recognized their superior intrinsic value. This is a textbook real-world example of what economists now call Gresham's Law, which means bad money drives good money out of circulation because people instinctively spend the debased currency first and hold on to the more valuable currency for themselves. This is just common sense. The reduction was subtle enough, particularly in the first wave under Nero, that it didn't trigger immediate panic or visible unrest among the general public. But Romans weren't financially naive. The base silver coins changed tone and wore differently than imperial ones, and professional money changers who handled thousands of coins daily remained absolutely central to financial life in Rome across the provinces would have noticed the shift faster and more precisely than ordinary merchants or everyday citizens. Trust in the currency persisted regardless, largely because the change was incremental, centrally coordinated, and rolled out within a unified imperial monetary system that people had no real alternative to. Interestingly, gold aurei largely retained their original weight and purity under Nero. There were practical reasons for this. Gold was simply easier for ordinary people to evaluate and verify, and it was more commonly hoarded outright rather than kept in active circulation, which may have limited how much gold the mint actually had readily available on hand to debase in the first place. Silver, by contrast, was the primary transactional currency of daily Roman life and was considerably harder for ordinary users to assess its precise purity just by looking at it or weighing a coin. That asymmetry is generally revealing. Nero targeted the most liquid, most widely circulated form of currency, not the most prestigious one. He went after the metal that would generate the most seigniorage with the least immediate public scrutiny. It's also worth noting that Nero maintained the official legal exchange ratio between gold and silver, even though Roman bimetallism was never a tightly arbitraged modern system. Market forces could still create a slight divergence in practice. Bronze token coinage, defined by law relative to silver units, adjusted proportionally, though bronze never carried the intrinsic value proportional to silver in the first place. By most accounts, Nero's debasement was politically almost invisible in the short term, precisely because the initial reduction was moderate. Prices didn't spiral into runaway inflation. The military, whose loyalty depended directly on reliable pay, didn't seem to notice or object, since payments continued without delay or disruption. The public continued to receive the cash distributions they expected. In the end, Nero's debasement likely functioned much like modern inflation does in modern economies. It's felt gradually, absorbed quietly, experienced by most people as a slow erosion of value rather than a sudden shock. It worked. In other words, precisely because nobody could pinpoint the exact moment it happened. But Nero had opened a door that proved very difficult to close. Over the following 2 centuries, Roman emperors returned to debasement again and again, not as an occasional emergency measure, but as a routine fiscal tool, particularly to fund military pay raises and finance civil wars. To be fair to Nero, he didn't single-handedly cause Rome's long-term monetary decline. Later emperors faced their own genuine pressures, including plagues and other revenue shocks that demanded some kind of fiscal response. But he established a precedent, and precedents, once normalized, are remarkably hard to walk back. It's worth adding one more layer of context here. The Roman Empire wasn't a sealed monetary system. It controlled major mining operations in Spain, Gaul, and the Balkans, but it also maintained active trade with Parthia, India, and territories beyond its formal borders. Bullion flowed into the empire through ongoing commerce, and border regions in particular still required functioning exchanges with outside currencies of varying purity. The empire was monetarily unified internally, but it was never fully isolated from the wider flows of precious metal moving in and out of the region. This is exactly the kind of pattern this podcast exists to trace, because what Nero did in 64 CE is not some isolated ancient curiosity. It's the first clearly documented instance of a fiscal strategy that governments have returned to in one form or another ever since. The most direct modern parallel sits closer to home than you might expect: the United States Coinage Act of 1965. By the early 1960s, the U.S. Treasury faced a problem that would have been entirely familiar to Roman mint officials. Rising industrial demand for silver, combined with growing public hoarding of silver coins as their metal value crept toward and threatened to exceed their face value, was rapidly draining government silver stockpiles. People had started melting dimes and quarters down for their bullion value, exactly the behavior Gresham's law predicts. President Lyndon Johnson, facing the prospect of the Treasury's silver reserves running out entirely by 1968, proposed removing silver from dimes and quarters altogether and reducing the half-dollar silver content from 90% down to 40%. Congress passed the Coinage Act of 1965, and from that point forward, American coins became clad, copper-nickel alloy bonded to a pure copper core with no silver content at all in the smaller denominations. The justification Johnson offered to Congress was almost identical in structure to whatever justification a Roman financial official might have given to Nero. The country needed a stable, adequate supply of coinage, and the precious metal in circulation was more valuably removed from circulation entirely than it was serving as a functional money. The half-dollar's remaining silver was phased out entirely by 1970. It was, in every meaningful structure sense, a modern act of debasement. Separating a coin's face value from its metal content 2,000 years after Nero had pioneered the same basic move with the denarius. A second, more famous modern parallel is the gradual American departure from the gold standard across the 20th century, culminating in President Nixon's 1971 decision to suspend the dollar's convertibility into gold entirely, an event now generally remembered as the Nixon shock. Where Nero quietly reduced the silver content of physical coins, Nixon severed the dollar's last formal link to a fixed quantity of precious metals altogether, transitioning the United States fully to a fiat currency system. The mechanics were different, but the underlying fiscal logic was strikingly similar. A government facing rising costs. In Nixon's case, the expenses of the Vietnam War, alongside domestic spending commitments, chose to loosen the link between its currency and a finite physical asset rather than raise taxes or cut spending through the slower, more politically painful channels available to it. And a more recent example of debasement's modern descendant, pure monetary expansion without any metal involved at all. You don't have to look back further than the response to the 2008 financial crisis, and even more dramatically, the economic shock of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. The Federal Reserve's quantitative easing programs across both periods expanded the central bank's balance sheet by trillions of dollars, effectively creating new money to purchase government bonds and other assets, injecting liquidity directly into the financial system. The mechanism bears no physical resemblance to clipping silver out of a Roman coin, but the underlying economic principle Nero would have instantly recognized. When a government needs more money than it currently has, and raising it through taxation is politically difficult or too slow, expanding the money supply is almost always the path of least resistance, right up until the moment it isn't, and inflation forces a painful reckoning. There is an even more recent and more visceral example worth mentioning: Venezuela's hyperinflation crisis through the 2010s. This was when the government's response to economic collapse was to print currency at an accelerating pace to cover the spending obligations it had no way to meet. Inflation eventually exceeded 1,000,000% annually at its peak. It's an extreme, modern echo of exactly the dynamic Kenneth Harl, the historian, identified in Nero's reign. Public faith in a currency is precisely what makes that currency's debasement possible in the first place. And once that faith is broken down completely, restoring it again is extraordinarily difficult. Nero's denarius reduction was modest by comparison to any of these later examples, gradual, contained, and in a very short term, almost unnoticed. But it represents the first clear instance of a recurring pattern in monetary history: a sovereign authority quietly trading the long-term integrity of its currency for short-term fiscal flexibility. Every government since has faced the same temptation. Most, eventually, have given into it at least once. In his later years, Nero leaned further and further into his artistic ambitions. He traveled to Greece, competed personally in athletic and musical festivals, and predictably declared himself the victor. To traditional Romans, this was humiliating: a sitting emperor competing for applause like a common performer. To many in the Greek-speaking eastern half of the empire, it was, by contrast, generally admired. But popularity, it turned out, couldn't shield him from the political reality forever. In 67 and 68 CE, revolts broke out in Gaul and Spain. The Senate formally declared him a public enemy. Abandoned by his remaining allies, Nero fled Rome, and facing immediate capture, he took his own life in 68 CE. His reported final words were, "What an artist dies in me." Read, even now, as a fittingly narcissistic epithet for a man who, to the very end, valued performance over substance. His death ended the Julian-Claudian dynasty that Augustus had founded more than a century earlier, and it plunged Rome into a civil war during the chaotic year of 4 emperors. And yet, Nero's story didn't fully end with him. For decades afterward, imposters claiming to be Nero, somehow miraculously still alive, emerged periodically across the Eastern Empire, and some of them gathered alarmingly real support. That tells you something important about how genuinely popular he had remained among parts of the population, regardless of how thoroughly the senatorial historians who wrote his official legacy despised him. So, who in the end was Nero? A murderer? Almost certainly. Of his mother, his stepbrother, and likely his second wife. A prosecutor of vulnerable religious minority? Yes. A self-indulgent, narcissistic performer? Absolutely. But also a ruler who understood spectacle, popular appeal, and political theater in ways that genuinely unsettled Roman traditional elites, and who quietly pioneered a fiscal tool that every government since has, at one point or another, reached for when the bill came due and the treasury came up short. Much of what we do know about Nero comes from senatorial historians writing under later emperors who had every political incentive to blacken his name. He probably wasn't quite the cartoonish monster of popular legend, but in the very specific, very Roman calculus of power, he committed something equally dangerous. He was an emperor who valued the applause of the crowd more than the approval of the aristocrats. And in Rome, that was very often a fatal mistake. That's a wrap on this episode. We went from Augustus, the accountant, quietly building the fiscal machine that would run the empire, through Tiberius, the disciplined steward, to Caligula's reckless spending spree, and finally to Nero, who discovered that the easiest way to fund a palace is to quietly take a sliver of silver out of everyone's pocket money. It's a pattern, as we've seen today, that didn't end with Rome. It just changed its tools. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the best thing you can do is leave a 5-star review and pass it along to someone who might appreciate it. Word of mouth is everything for an independent show like this one. If you want to support this podcast directly and keep it going, you can find us on Patreon at patreon.com/historyofmoneybankingtrade or visit our website at moneybankingtrade.com. Until next time, I'm Mike D, and this has been the History of Money, Banking, and Trade.